More than 400 years ago, a small group of settlers crossed the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new life. They arrived in a distant land filled with promise, determined to build one of England's first permanent colonies in the New World. The journey was dangerous, the challenges were immense, and survival was never guaranteed. Yet despite these hardships, the settlers remained hopeful that they could create a future for themselves and their families. Then, something extraordinary happened. The colony vanished. When the governor eventually returned after years away, he expected to find the settlement waiting for him. Instead, he found abandoned buildings, empty homes, and no sign of the people he had left behind. There were no bodies, no clear evidence of violence, no explanation written in any record. Only a single mysterious clue remained behind. To this day, historians continue to debate what happened to the men, women, and children of Roanoke. Did they join a nearby Native American community? Did they relocate and establish a new settlement elsewhere? Did disease, starvation, or conflict bring about their end? Or is the truth something we have yet to uncover? For centuries, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists has remained one of history's most enduring mysteries. Tonight, we will journey back to the late 16th century, to a time when vast oceans separated worlds, when maps still contained unknown lands, and when brave settlers attempted to build a new life on the edge of the known world. Together, we will follow the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, examine the evidence that remains, and explore the theories that continue to fascinate historians today. So settle in, relax, and allow the story to unfold. This is the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke. Chapter 1. A New World Across the Ocean. In the late 16th century, the world was changing. For centuries, the vast Atlantic Ocean had formed a barrier between Europe and the lands of North America. To many Europeans, the western horizon remained a place of mystery. Maps were incomplete. Coastlines were poorly understood. Beyond the ocean lay territories that few had seen, and even fewer truly understood. Yet the promise of these distant lands captured the imagination of an entire generation. Across Europe, powerful kingdoms competed for wealth, influence, and territory. Spain had already established a vast empire in the Americas, sending ships loaded with gold and silver back across the Atlantic. News of these riches spread throughout Europe, inspiring both admiration and envy. England watched closely. English leaders feared being left behind in this race for power and opportunity. If Spain could build colonies across the ocean, perhaps England could do the same. The challenge was enormous. Crossing the Atlantic in the 16th century was not a simple voyage. The journey could take weeks or even months. Storms threatened ships constantly. Navigation remained difficult and imprecise. A single mistake could send a vessel hundreds of miles off course. And yet people were willing to take the risk. Some dreamed of wealth, others sought adventure, some hoped to spread England's influence, and many simply believed that a better future awaited them in the New World. One of the most important figures behind England's colonial ambitions was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a soldier, explorer, writer, and favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. Like many ambitious men of his time, he believed England should establish colonies across the Atlantic. In 1584, Raleigh received royal permission to explore and settle parts of North America. Soon, expeditions were sent across the ocean to investigate potential locations. Explorers returned with reports of forests, rivers, fertile land, and coastlines that appeared suitable for settlement. Among the locations they examined was a small island along the coast of what is now North Carolina. The island was called Roanoke. At first glance, it seemed promising. Roanoke Island sat near protected waterways and offered access to both the ocean and the mainland. The surrounding region appeared rich in natural resources. Fish were plentiful. Forests provided timber. The climate seemed far more favorable than many parts of Europe. To English eyes, it looked like an ideal place to establish a colony. Of course, the land was not empty. For thousands of years, Native American communities had lived throughout the region. They possessed their own cultures, traditions, languages, and trade networks. They understood the land far better than any European visitor. The English newcomers were entering a world that was already home to many people. At first, relations between explorers and local tribes varied. Some encounters were friendly. Others were marked by misunderstanding and tension. Neither side fully understood the other. Differences in language, customs, and expectations often created confusion. Still, the English remained focused on their goal. In 1585, an early attempt was made to establish a settlement on Roanoke Island. The colony struggled almost immediately. Food became scarce. Relations with some local groups deteriorated. Supplies ran low. Within a year, most of the settlers abandoned the colony and returned to England. For many people, such a failure might have ended the dream. But Raleigh refused to give up. He remained convinced that a permanent English colony could succeed. A second attempt was organized. This new expedition would be different. Rather than sending mostly soldiers and adventurers, the English planned to establish a true community. Families would be included. Men, women, and children would make the journey together. They would not simply explore, they would build homes, plant crops, raise families, and create a lasting settlement. In 1587, approximately 115 colonists prepared to leave England. For many, it was the most important decision of their lives. Some would never again see the towns and villages where they had grown up. Some would never again walk the streets of England. They were placing their future in the hands of the sea. The ships carried tools, supplies, and hopes for a better life. The Atlantic crossing was long and difficult, as such voyages often were. Cramped conditions, rough weather, and uncertainty accompanied the settlers throughout the journey. Yet despite these hardships, excitement remained. Ahead of them lay opportunity, a chance to build something new, a chance to become part of history. When the settlers finally arrived at Roanoke Island, they faced an unfamiliar landscape filled with both promise and uncertainty. The forests stretched endlessly beyond the settlement. The sounds of unfamiliar birds echoed through the trees. The coastline seemed vast and untamed. For some, it must have felt like the beginning of a grand adventure. For others, it may have felt frightening. Few could have imagined that they were about to become part of one of history's greatest mysteries. At that moment, however, the future still appeared hopeful. Homes would be built, fields would be planted, a community would take shape. The dream of a permanent English colony seemed within reach. But creating a new life in an unfamiliar land would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. And the challenges facing the settlers were only beginning. Chapter 2. Building the Colony. When the settlers arrived at Roanoke Island in 1587, they carried with them more than supplies and tools. They carried expectations. Many had crossed an ocean believing they were helping to build the future. The colony was meant to become a permanent English settlement, a place where families could live, work, and prosper. Unlike earlier expeditions, this was not simply a group of soldiers or explorers. These were ordinary people, men and women, parents and children, people hoping to create a new home in an unfamiliar land. The task before them was enormous. Everything had to be built from the ground up. The colonists began constructing houses from the materials available around them. Trees were cut and shaped into wooden structures. Roofs were built. Storage areas were established for supplies. Slowly, the settlement began to take shape. Each completed building represented progress. Each wall raised against the wilderness was evidence that the colony might survive. But life on the edge of the known world was not easy. The settlers quickly discovered that the land was very different from England. The climate felt unfamiliar. The plants and animals were often unknown to them. Even simple tasks became difficult when performed in an environment they did not fully understand. Food was one of the greatest concerns. The supplies brought from England could not last forever. Eventually, the colonists would need to support themselves. Fishing helped provide food. Hunting offered another source of meat. The surrounding waters contained fish and shellfish, while the forests held game that could be hunted. Yet relying on these resources required knowledge and experience. The local Native American communities possessed generations of understanding about the region. The English settlers did not. Agriculture presented its own challenges. Crops needed to be planted and harvested successfully. The settlers had to learn which methods worked in the local conditions. A poor harvest could quickly become a serious problem. In a remote colony separated from England by thousands of miles of ocean, there was no easy way to obtain emergency supplies. Mistakes carried consequences. At first, some interactions between the colonists and nearby Native American groups were peaceful. Trade occasionally took place. Knowledge could be exchanged. The newcomers depended heavily on local assistance during their early months, but relations were complicated. Trust was difficult to build. Misunderstandings were common. Both sides viewed the other through unfamiliar customs and beliefs. Tensions that had developed during earlier English expeditions had not completely disappeared. As a result, relationships could shift rapidly from cooperation to suspicion. The colonists soon realized that survival required more than hard work. It required stability, and stability was difficult to achieve. Every day brought new uncertainties. Would crops grow successfully? Would supplies last long enough? Would relations with neighboring communities remain peaceful? Would additional support arrive from England? No one could answer these questions with confidence. Despite the difficulties, life continued. Children played among the newly built homes. Meals were prepared. Repairs were made. Work filled nearly every hour of the day. Much of colonial life involved ordinary routines. The settlers woke each morning with tasks to complete and problems to solve. They were not living inside a mystery. They were simply trying to survive. One event during this period brought a moment of hope. In August of 1587, a child was born in the colony. Her name was Virginia Dare. She became the first known English child born in North America. To many colonists, her birth symbolized the future they hoped to create, a new generation growing up in the new world, a sign that their settlement might endure. Today, Virginia Dare remains one of the most famous figures associated with Roanoke, not because of anything she personally did, but because her life became intertwined with the colony's fate. Like the other settlers, she would eventually disappear into the mystery. As the weeks passed, however, concerns continued to grow. The colony faced shortages. Resources were limited. The settlers needed additional supplies if they hoped to thrive. Attention increasingly turned toward the colony's governor, John White. White had traveled with the settlers and shared their hopes for the settlement's success. He understood the challenges they faced. He also understood that waiting too long could prove disastrous. The colony needed help. Food, tools and supplies would have to come from England. Without support, the future looked uncertain. Eventually, the settlers made a difficult decision. John White would return across the Atlantic. He would gather the supplies the colony required and then come back as quickly as possible. The plan seemed reasonable. White expected to be gone only a short time. The settlers would maintain the colony while he secured assistance. Soon he would return with everything needed to strengthen their chances of survival. None of them could know that events far beyond Roanoke Island were about to intervene. What should have been a relatively brief absence would stretch into years. And when White finally returned, the colony he had left behind would be gone. But in 1587, standing among the newly built homes of Roanoke, nobody could have imagined such an outcome. The settlement still existed. The dream was still alive, and John White was preparing to make the journey that would change everything. Chapter 3. The Governor Leaves. By the late summer of 1587, the settlement at Roanoke had survived its first difficult months. Homes had been built. Families had begun adapting to their new surroundings. Fields were being worked. Daily routines were taking shape. From a distance it may have appeared that the colony was slowly finding its footing, but beneath the surface serious problems remained. Food supplies were limited. Resources were stretched thin. The settlers faced constant uncertainty about the future. The wilderness surrounding them was vast and unfamiliar, and the colony remained isolated from England by thousands of miles of open ocean. The people of Roanoke knew they could not survive indefinitely without assistance. Additional supplies would be needed, perhaps even more settlers. Without support from England, the colony's chances of long-term success seemed uncertain. As concerns grew, the settlers turned to their governor, John White. White was more than a colonial administrator. He was also an artist and observer who had spent years learning about the region. He understood both the opportunities and the dangers facing the settlement. The colonists trusted him. If anyone could secure the help they needed, it was White. Reluctantly, a decision was made. John White would sail back to England. Once there, he would gather supplies and return as quickly as possible. It was not an ideal solution. The colony needed leadership. Many settlers worried about being left behind. White himself had reasons to hesitate. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, lived in the colony. So did his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the infant born only weeks earlier. Leaving meant saying goodbye to family members he cared about deeply, but there seemed to be no alternative. The colony needed help. White promised he would return soon. The settlers likely believed him. So did White himself. None of them expected the separation to last very long. In late 1587, he boarded a ship and began the long journey back across the Atlantic. As the coastline of North America disappeared behind him, White could not have known that he was seeing Roanoke for the last time. The voyage to England was difficult, but successful. Upon arriving, White immediately began seeking support for the struggling colony. His goal was simple: gather supplies, organize a relief expedition, return to Roanoke. Under normal circumstances, he might have accomplished exactly that. But England was facing a crisis of its own. At that very moment, tensions between England and Spain were reaching dangerous levels. The two nations had become bitter rivals. Religious differences, political disputes, and competition for power had pushed them toward conflict. War seemed increasingly likely. Soon, events far larger than the fate of a small colony began to dominate England's attention. The Spanish Empire was the most powerful force in Europe. Its fleets controlled vast territories. Its wealth appeared endless. And now Spain was preparing a massive invasion force. The threat was so serious that England mobilized nearly every available ship for national defense. Vessels that might otherwise have sailed to North America were instead ordered to remain closer to home. The needs of Roanoke suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of invasion. John White found himself trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Again and again, attempts to organize a return voyage were delayed. Ships were unavailable. Resources were diverted elsewhere. Months passed. Then more months. White grew increasingly frustrated. Every delay meant more time passing for the settlers he had left behind. He knew they depended upon supplies. He knew they expected him to return. Yet there was little he could do. Then, in 1588, the crisis reached its peak. The Spanish Armada set sail. It was one of the largest fleets ever assembled in Europe. Its mission was to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. The outcome would shape the future of nations. For England, survival came first. Every available effort focused on defeating the Spanish threat. The colony at Roanoke faded into the background. The fighting that followed became one of the most famous events in English history. Against considerable odds, England successfully resisted the invasion. Storms scattered portions of the Armada. Naval engagements weakened the Spanish fleet. Eventually, the threat passed. England celebrated a remarkable victory. For John White, however, the victory brought little immediate comfort. Years had already been lost. The colony remained alone across the Atlantic, and White still had not returned. As time passed, his concern must have grown. He likely wondered about his daughter, his granddaughter, the families he had promised to help. Were they still alive? Had they found enough food? Had they remained on Roanoke Island? No letters could reach him. No reports arrived. The Atlantic Ocean had effectively cut him off from all knowledge of their fate. The uncertainty must have been agonizing. Finally, after years of delays, White secured passage aboard a ship heading toward North America. The opportunity came in 1590, nearly 3 years after he had left the colony. 3 years. Far longer than anyone had expected. Far longer than the settlers could possibly have planned for. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, White must have imagined the reunion awaiting him. Perhaps the colony had survived despite the hardships. Perhaps new homes had been built. Perhaps children had grown and families had prospered. Perhaps Virginia Dare, once an infant, was now running through the settlement as a toddler. Soon he would know. The voyage eventually brought him back to the waters near Roanoke Island. At last, after years of frustration and uncertainty, John White was returning to the colony he had left behind. But what he would find there was not what he expected. The settlement was no longer waiting for him, and the mystery that would endure for centuries was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Empty Settlement. In August of 1590, nearly 3 years after leaving Roanoke, John White finally returned to the colony. The journey back across the Atlantic had been long and uncertain. For years, he had been forced to wait while England focused on war and national survival. Now, at last, he was approaching the settlement he had left behind in 1587. He carried more than supplies and hope. He carried expectations. White expected to find the colonists waiting for him. Perhaps they would be struggling. Perhaps they would need immediate assistance. But surely they would still be there. As his ship neared the coast, he searched the shoreline for signs of life. Smoke from cooking fires, movement among the trees, evidence that the colony had endured. Instead, something felt wrong. The settlement appeared strangely quiet. No welcoming party emerged from the shoreline. No boats approached the ship. No signals greeted the returning governor. The silence was unsettling. Eventually, White and a small group went ashore to investigate. As they entered the settlement, the scene before them became increasingly difficult to understand. The colony was deserted. The people were gone. At first, White may have believed the settlers were temporarily away. Perhaps they were hunting, fishing, exploring nearby areas. But as he moved through the settlement, it became clear that something far more significant had occurred. The houses were empty. The streets were silent. There were no voices, no children, no families, no signs of everyday life. The colony that had once housed more than 100 people had vanished. Naturally, White began searching for clues. What had happened during his absence? Where had everyone gone? The answers were nowhere to be found. There were no bodies, no graves, no evidence of a massacre, no signs of a battle. If violence had occurred, it had left remarkably little trace behind. This immediately distinguished Roanoke from many other historical mysteries. When settlements are destroyed by conflict, evidence usually remains. Weapons, burned buildings, human remains. At Roanoke, none of these obvious signs appeared. Instead, the settlement showed evidence of something else. The colonists seemed to have left deliberately. Several structures had been dismantled rather than destroyed. Wood had been removed carefully. This suggested planning rather than panic. The people had not simply disappeared overnight. At least some preparations appeared to have been made. For White, this offered a small measure of hope. Years earlier, before he departed for England, a plan had been discussed. If the settlers ever decided to relocate, they would leave a message indicating where they had gone. A specific signal had even been agreed upon. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they would carve a cross alongside their message. White remembered this clearly. Now he searched desperately for any sign the colonists had left behind. Eventually he found one. Carved into a wooden post was a single word: Croatoan. Nearby, the word Croat was reportedly carved into a tree. It was the first real clue, and for more than 4 centuries it would remain one of the most famous clues in American history. To White, the word had an immediate meaning. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, known today as Hatteras Island. It was also associated with a Native American community that lived in the region. Perhaps the colonists had relocated there. Perhaps they had joined friendly allies. Perhaps the mystery was not a tragedy at all. Most importantly, no cross accompanied the message. That detail mattered greatly. The absence of the agreed warning sign suggested that the settlers had not left under immediate threat, at least according to the plan they had established years earlier. For White, this offered another reason for optimism. The colonists might still be alive. They might simply be somewhere else. Determined to follow the clue, White hoped to travel to Croatoan Island and continue the search. Unfortunately, circumstances intervened once again. Bad weather threatened the ships. Strong winds complicated navigation. The captains were unwilling to take further risks. Despite White's objections, the expedition prepared to leave. His chance to investigate the clue slipped away. It was a devastating moment. After waiting nearly 3 years to return, he had finally found evidence pointing toward a possible answer. Yet he could not pursue it. The ships departed, and with them went John White. He would never return to Roanoke. The colonists were never found. No official record emerged explaining their fate. No survivor came forward with a detailed account of what had happened. The mystery remained. As years turned into decades, stories began to spread. People wondered whether the settlers had perished. Others believed they had joined Native American communities and started new lives. Some imagined darker possibilities. Without clear evidence, speculation filled the empty spaces left behind by history. What made the disappearance so fascinating was not merely that people vanished. History contains many examples of settlements that failed. What made Roanoke different was the absence of certainty. The colony did not leave behind a clear ending. Instead, it left behind questions. Questions that historians still ask today. What happened during those 3 years? Why did the settlers leave? Did they relocate voluntarily? Did they survive? And if they did, where did they go? The abandoned buildings offered few answers. The missing colonists left no explanation, and the mysterious word carved into wood only deepened the puzzle. Croatoan, a single clue, a single word, and perhaps the most famous unsolved mystery in early American history. But while the people of Roanoke disappeared, the evidence they left behind did not. Over the centuries, historians, archaeologists, and researchers have carefully examined every clue, every document, and every theory in an effort to solve the mystery. What they have discovered is both fascinating and frustrating, because while several explanations appear possible, none have been proven beyond doubt. And so, more than 400 years later, the search for the fate of the lost colony continues. Chapter 5. What happened to Roanoke? When John White sailed away from Roanoke in 1590, he left behind an abandoned settlement, a handful of clues, and a mystery that would endure for centuries. More than 400 years later, historians are still trying to answer the same question. What happened to the colonists? The challenge is not a lack of interest. Generations of researchers have studied the evidence. Documents have been examined. Archaeological excavations have been conducted. New theories have emerged. Old theories have been challenged. Yet, despite all this effort, no explanation has been proven beyond doubt. The fate of the lost colony remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Certain facts are well documented. The colony existed. John White left in 1587. He returned in 1590. The settlement had been abandoned. No bodies were discovered. No obvious signs of a violent attack were found. The word Croato had been carved into a post. Those facts form the foundation of the mystery. Everything beyond them involves interpretation. Some explanations appear more likely than others, but none can be considered certain. The most widely accepted theory among many historians is that at least some of the colonists joined local Native American communities. This idea is closely connected to the clue left behind at the settlement. Croatoan referred to both a nearby island and the people who lived there. Relations between the English settlers and the Croatoan people had generally been better than relations with some other groups in the region. If the colony faced food shortages or other difficulties, relocating to Croatoan may have seemed like a sensible decision. The settlers would have gained access to people who understood the land, the climate, and the resources available in the region. They would not have been starting from nothing. Some historical accounts recorded years later described Native American communities that appeared to possess European objects. There were even reports of individuals with features that observers considered unusual for the area. Such accounts are difficult to verify and should be treated cautiously. However, they contributed to the belief that some colonists may have been absorbed into local populations. If this theory is correct, the disappearance was not necessarily a tragedy. The colonists may simply have chosen survival over isolation. Over time, their descendants would have become part of existing communities, leaving behind few clear traces of their English origins. Another theory suggests that the settlers moved inland. Rather than relocating to Croatoan Island itself, they may have established a new settlement somewhere deeper within the region. This possibility is supported by the practical realities facing the colony. Roanoke Island had presented challenges from the beginning. Food was limited. Resources were sometimes difficult to obtain. A more favorable location may have appeared attractive. Some archaeological discoveries have fueled interest in this idea. Artifacts linked to the Roanoke settlers have been found at sites away from the original colony. These discoveries do not provide definitive proof, but they suggest that at least some movement may have occurred. Whether the entire colony relocated together or smaller groups traveled separately remains unknown. The evidence is incomplete. A third possibility is that the colonists simply could not survive. The challenges facing them were severe. Food shortages could quickly become deadly. Disease posed a constant threat. Harsh weather and isolation made every problem more dangerous. Without regular supplies from England, the settlement may have gradually collapsed. If starvation or illness played a major role, the surviving colonists may have dispersed in search of help. Some may have joined neighboring communities. Others may have died while attempting to relocate. In this scenario, the disappearance would not have been the result of a single dramatic event, but rather a slow struggle against circumstances that became impossible to overcome. Another theory involves conflict. Throughout history, colonies and settlements have sometimes faced violence from neighboring groups or rival powers. Could that have happened at Roanoke? It is certainly possible. The region was complex, and relationships between different communities were not always peaceful. However, this explanation faces an important challenge: the evidence. John White reported no clear signs of a battle, no burned settlement, no obvious remains. No indication of a large-scale attack. While conflict cannot be completely ruled out, Many historians believe the lack of physical evidence makes it less convincing than some of the other possibilities. Over the centuries, more imaginative explanations have occasionally appeared. Some people have proposed secret conspiracies. Others have suggested supernatural causes. Stories of curses, mysterious disappearances, and hidden forces have become attached to Roanoke's legend. Such ideas may be entertaining, but they are not supported by credible historical evidence. The real mystery is compelling enough without them. In recent decades, modern archaeology has provided new clues. Researchers have used technologies unavailable to earlier generations. Ground surveys, excavations, detailed analysis of artifacts, historical mapping. Each new discovery adds another small piece to the puzzle. Yet no breakthrough has fully solved the mystery. Instead, the evidence often raises new questions. A clue that supports one theory may create problems for another. A discovery that seems promising may later prove inconclusive. The search continues, and perhaps that is why Roanoke remains so fascinating. Most historical mysteries eventually receive an answer. New evidence emerges. Records are discovered, questions are resolved. Roanoke has resisted that process. For more than 4 centuries, it has remained suspended between certainty and speculation. Historians know enough to construct possibilities, but not enough to reach a final conclusion. Perhaps the colonists joined the Croatoan people. Perhaps they moved inland and built a new life elsewhere. Perhaps disease, starvation, or hardship gradually scattered them. Perhaps the truth involves several of these explanations at once. The reality may have been far more complex than any single theory suggests. What is certain is that the people of Roanoke were real. They were not legends. They were families. Parents, children, neighbors, ordinary people who crossed an ocean in search of a better future. Somewhere in the forests, rivers, and coastal islands of the late 16th century, their story reached an ending. Unfortunately, history failed to preserve exactly what that ending was. And so the lost colony remains lost. More than 400 years have passed since John White stood among the empty buildings of Roanoke and searched for answers. Generations have come and gone. Empires have risen and fallen. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet the mystery remains. A deserted settlement, a vanished community, a single word carved into wood, and a question that continues to echo through history. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Perhaps one day new evidence will finally provide an answer. Until then, the fate of the colonists remains one of history's oldest and most enduring mysteries.